a choice right now, between fear and love. It's just a rock.
Out of the dark night of ignorance and into the shining light of truth.
Expanding reality.
A population of citizens capable of critical thinking.
We don't see things as they are, we see them as we are.
There's a level of reality where everything dissolves into an ocean of energy.
We empower our experience by insisting on our authenticity.
That's very profound. Very.
Expanding reality.
Welcome to Expanding Reality. I am your host, Brandon Thomas. On this episode, we have Graeme Rendall. He wrote an incredible book called UFOs Before Roswell, European Foo Fighters 1940 to 1945. Now, that specific time range is what he focused on because of how many accounts. He's got tons of accounts in this book that have never been reported anywhere else. His research, guys, is unbelievably fascinating. He takes his interests, which are ufology, aviation, and German secret weapons, and marries them together in this one outstanding book. So, of course, that will be linked down in the show notes, as well as all the other ways to find Graeme. Also down there, real quick, is the link to the website. So, expandingrealitypodcast.com. That is where links to all the socials will be. YouTube, Patreon, if you want to contribute. We've got all of the Instagrams and stuff like that. All of it's linked through that one hub. On that as well is going to be our merchandise, which is through TeePublic. Very excited to partner with them, as well as Rokfin for our premium content. So also very excited to partner with them. So guys, let's just get right into this episode. Graeme is phenomenal. You will love this conversation. He is so smart. It is a lot of fun. So let's get to it here. This is Graeme Rendall. All right, ladies and gentlemen, a very exciting episode today. We have Graeme Rendall on. You wrote an incredible book, UFOs Before Roswell. Of course, the European Foo Fighters 1940 to 1945. It's a phenomenal breakdown. You did some incredible work in this. As you can see, I'm holding it here for the visual audience. It is incredibly dense. You did some incredible research in this thing, man. And Your focus on the time period and the UFOs in particular, the Foo Fighters rather, are fascinating to me. So tell the audience just a little bit about yourself and we'll get cracking.
Okay, yeah. My name's Graeme Rendall. I live in the north of England in the UK. I've had this interest, as you say, in aviation, but also in German secret weapons and World War II in general, but also ufology for the best part of 40 to 45 years now. And in the Foo Fighters, these three interests of mine that have ran through my life came together. So it was a perfect opportunity to write about something that I felt that I knew about, rather than trying to research something that I didn't have much of a clue about. And I thought that, if I hadn't written this book, then maybe nobody might have. And this was a book I wanted to read myself, but it didn't seem to be available. So I felt like I had to sit down and read it, to write it rather. So yeah, so there it is.
And it's an incredible book. Your breakdown, like I said, your research, and that time period is very, very important. That's right before the large flap, with Kenneth Arnold. You also had Roswell occurring just after this. But the point of interest in this war in particular, with the high strangeness that occurred, and it seems like this happened right at that time. It seems like before World War I and stuff, you didn't have as much of these reports. You had some really anomalous type of things, but they weren't directly related to an aeronautics type of phenomena that seemed to be an enemy combatant type of technology, or it was confused as that because everybody thought that they were weapons from the other side. So this particular point of interest is absolutely fascinating. So if you don't mind, let's start super basic, man. Give us what a Foo Fighter is.
Yeah, so the name Foo Fighter was coined by an American serviceman who was actually an Air Force radar observer who was serving with a night fighter unit who were based in eastern France in the winter of 1944, November 1944 to be precise. And for the next 6 months or so, the crews of this particular unit and others in Belgium and also northern Italy, flying over that area as well, started to see red lights and other types of lights flying around, sometimes following their aircraft, sometimes chasing after them. And if that was the case, they tried all sorts of maneuvers to get them off their tails, but they just stayed there. And then, of course, they disappeared off their own volition. And the crews were quite rattled about these things because they did, as you said, they thought they were probably German secret weapons, and there was no way of shaking them off. But they weren't doing anything hostile. But it was just a very, very weird set of events. You mentioned before about I'll just go on and say this if you don't mind. You mentioned about the time frame and the specificness of it. Now, there's actually a popular misconception really that ran through from about from December 1945, when a magazine article was published, the first public mention really of the Foo Fighters, right through to about the mid-1990s, that it was a very, very small localized phenomenon. And that basically comes by a magazine article which had about half a dozen different reports from one particular intelligence report that went up the food chain, detailing some of these cases, but actually there were a lot more. But all that was in the public realm were these small number of cases, and a couple from the Pacific War, and another one from a squadron that was operating in the daylight over Germany. So that's all the people had to go on. So when you look at the UFO books that were written in the 50s, 60s, etc., 70s, etc., they have very little information on the Foo Fighters. So of course, naturally, people thought it was just some very, very small scale thing, and it wasn't that worth bothering with. So that's why a lot of modern ufology starts with Kenneth Arnold, with Roswell, 1947.
What's interesting you said about the localized phenomena of these, because it reminds me of things like the Min Min lights, like Richard Rokfin's book, The Lights on Burnt and Acid Hill, over there in Warwickshire, I believe. And yes, and then you've got the Marfa lights over here in West Texas. So there does seem to be this sort of localized phenomena type thing. And then you think even further to things like the Skinwalker Ranch, about the Meadow, Trey Hudson's work. And you think that maybe this is something having to do with like an atmospheric phenomena, something to do with aquifers under the ground, some electromagnetic type of a thing. But it is interesting that these appear to be under intelligent control rather than just sort of lights in the distance. I like this. I do think that this is an excellent observation. So what do you think the Foo Fighters are?
Well, if I could tell you that, I could probably solve the rest of the ufology riddle as well.
I agree. Yeah.
So I can't do that. I was never ever going to be able to tell people what they were. I think that's probably for other people to try and work out sometime distant in the future when we have much more information. This is effectively like baby steps into this particular phenomenon in the time frame that I'm talking about and we're talking about here. I don't think this book was ever going to be able to solve the riddle. It's more for people to then use as a springboard for their own research into maybe going through their own family history in terms of the people who fought in the war, and they can look through things like logbooks, or maybe do their own research in official records. Because there are more records in America and even Germany, which I haven't looked at, so far. So the scope for much more examination of this particular phenomenon. Now, you also mentioned about the specificness of it in terms of its locality. Well, it is to a certain extent, but actually the phenomenon was seen right across Europe. So there were reports from the North Cape of Norway down to North Africa, from the Bay of Biscay off France, right across to the Eastern Front. So yes, it was possibly localized in terms of the reporting in certain areas, but actually that might have been just down to the nature of the units, how good they were at reporting things and how diligent the intelligence officers were. Because the one I mentioned before about the list that was sent up the chain, that was actually one particular intelligence officer from one squadron going above and beyond what was expected of him. Because other similar staff members from other squadrons weren't doing that. And if you look at the RAF units, which I've got some information in the book about, some of them are quite patchy in terms of what they wrote down after the raids. Some of them were writing down what the crews said verbatim, otherwise, or sometimes they were just writing down little bits of it, and sometimes they were ignoring it full stop. So there might be quite a lot more reports out there we're not privy to and may never ever be privy to, but they may have happened.
This is an interesting point you bring up, because we do talk about like pilots that are scared to report things, because they'll get their wings pulled. They won't be able to fly. They'll be grounded. And so you're really depending on the accuracy and the forthcomingness of these pilots reporting these things, not only accurately, but at all. I think that that's a brilliant way to put it, because simply put, I mean, like you said, we may never know what happened with this. Another thing that's interesting to me is the as far as the locality goes, would be like ley lines, would be these types of areas where high strangeness phenomena seem to occur, but especially in times of, I'll just say, vibrationally dense histories where you had like a world war going on. I mean, these are things that if they are under intelligent control or something, they'd probably want to check out and see like, okay, what are these monkeys doing with this, these airplanes and all that stuff? They're flying around, destroying each other. We got to check it out and be kind of observational with it. And then because you hear hear other reports of UFOs kind of shutting down nuclear missile silos and intervening in a way to where they kind of take matches away from children. I know I want to say that was Senator Reid quoting on the Phenomena movie with James Fox. It's like we're taking matches away from kids. You guys shouldn't be playing with that stuff, right? So it is interesting that the observational aspect of this as well. Do you think that there's anything to that observation?
It's possible because people have theorized, in the past that the modern day UFO phenomenon started with the first atom bombs being exploded. And that's why it kicked off in, say, 46 with the ghost rockets and then 47 sightings. But you have to remember that fission was probably invented, was in 1938, and the Manhattan Project kicked off in 1942. So if they were aware of maybe people, our potential as a species, I mean, I'm just theorizing here. This is not, a hard and fast argument, but they could have been looking at us much earlier. But also it might be, as you say, it might be just the fact there was a world conflict going on and it was, look, let's see what the monkeys are doing, Yeah. So, or it could be simply just a case of there were 10,000 people flying around the skies each night.
Yes.
It could be simple. It could be just down to numbers and the kind of frequency and the location of people flying around, not just in the daytime, because there were things seen in the day as well, but also more at night. So people might have seen weird lights and other phenomenon because there was just down to the sheer weight of numbers.
And it's funny you mentioned the year 1938, because wasn't there a report of a Nazi recovered crashed UFO in that time period?
There are stories of various ones. There's certainly one from Poland, which is supposed to have been given to the Germans. There are other ones earlier as well. Now, with all these kind of stories about the Nazis being involved with flying discs, and you've looked at my book, you'll see how I go into some of that in detail. It's the kind of thing you have to take with a pinch of salt because there's absolutely no evidence. There never has been evidence. There's a lot of people claim they've had evidence, but when it's boiled down, it comes down to a few newspaper reports from the early 1950s with some so-called designers saying that they were involved in various projects, but none of them have ever been able to offer any proof for these things to ever exist. And all you would need is just be, say, a requisition form for some materials or for some testing locations or just for some personnel in terms of building or flying one of these things. And that would be enough to blow the whole thing wide open, but nothing exists. And yet you've got some fairly esoteric secret weapon projects, which are documented in full in terms of photographic evidence of trials, of interviews with designers and documentation for things like I just spoke about before. But none of this ever exists with the flying discs. And for such a sophisticated project to occur, you would need a lot of things to happen in order to put it in place. That's not something you can cook up in a backyard somewhere. So I don't believe them much, I'm afraid.
No, and that's fine. It's a very you take a very methodical look at this. I'm a little more heads in the clouds. I'm a very whimsical kind of like yeah, it's all possible kind of guy.
Fair enough.
And I like that, but it takes looking into research like what you provide for me to kind of come up with these crazy theories. It's like I take a real grounded, solid theory like yours and go, well, what if it's time travel? And I that's just kind of where I go with it because I like to consider all of it. Now, there are kind of like what you said about the reports. About Nazi secret weapons, we of course think of the Bell or the Wunderwaffen that they were talking about, and then allegedly there's been a concrete structure that they found over there, and that they say that's where it was housed to test, and all of these interesting things, and they're fun, man. I mean, these stories are so much fun.
Oh yeah, they are.
And you look at things like Operation High Jump, and going down to New Schwabenland in Antarctica and the battle, that took place there and just handed, the military their hat and sent them home, the U.S. military. And, all of these things are so much fun. Do you think any validity to any of it, even though you can't connect the dots directly?
Do you know what? A long time ago, so I heard about those stories probably 35, maybe almost 40 years ago. And I thought they were fun then. I was at the time, I was quite young, and it was almost like I wanted to believe those things were true because they were so exciting and so radical and just so beyond what accepted wisdom was. But then you get a bit older and a bit wise and you start looking at things and you try and look for facts and you just can't find any whatsoever. And then the things that people say about, oh, well, this is what actually happened. Well, when you look into it, no, it didn't. So therefore you can blow holes in a lot of it. And then what you're left with is just people's stories, or a nice little narrative, but actually doesn't add up to much at the end of the day because there is simply no evidence whatever to back up any of it. Even just a smallest shred would be enough. But yes, there was a time when I used to think, oh, that's really interesting. I wish that was true. And I think it's a bit of this kind of wish fulfillment. And also there might be some kind of neo-Nazi element back in the 60s when a lot of these stories apparently appeared for some of this nonsense. And I will call it nonsense because I don't go into the bell because that's just completely nuts, basically. I can explain why I feel that way. I don't go in that far, but I do talk about the German flying discs, and I do talk about some other radical weapons that a particular Italian author came up with in the 1960s. And a lot of people who talk about the Foo Fighters go back to that as well as a potential explanation. And if you look at websites, about the Foo Fighters, his name and these things crop up all the time. So it was a case of playing whack-a-mole, basically, with a lot of these kind of stories about the discs and about the aerial flak mines. And I thought the Die Glocke, the bell, as you say, was just one step too far. And I do mention it by name, but I say, look, if you want to do your own search, go knock yourself out. Because basically it was a Polish guy who reckoned he'd seen an intelligence document that the Polish army had received based on an interview of an SS leader who had been based in Poland. And it was about some facility that had been underground at the end of the war in the mountains. And as you say, this facility above it, which was this kind of concrete structure in a circle. And it seems to be that was actually the basis of a water tower. But also the police, the SS police leader, the guy who's supposed to have provided this conversation or this interview, he was shipped off to Norway at the end of 1944. He was never even in Poland for the last 6 months of the war anyway. So I'm not entirely sure how he could be privy to a secret weapons program right at the end of the war. So none of it really makes sense. When you start digging into it, just superficially, it's a kind of, and then I hear things about the guy who came up with all this stuff, Witkowski, I believe they call him, and some of the the books he'd written about other German secret weapons, and some of the reviews are a bit kind of, that's not entirely kind of great, that book. And I just think, okay, I'm just going to leave it. I'm just going to leave it there, and I'm not going to go any further because I don't want to spend my time chasing after kind of ghosts, basically.
I love it. You just see a book about Nazis and flying discs, and you're like, 1 star, get out of here. Not even worth my time.
Funny enough, I mean, my library back here, I do have books on sort of that kind of stuff, and I have entertained it in the past in so much as it's good background, and I will look at it. I'm not just going to go, oh, I don't believe that without looking at it. Don't get me wrong, but I need a bit more than what's there, because everything that I've read so far just points back to the certain handful of things which, when you look at those and you get them in your hand, they just crumble away, and that you're left with absolutely nothing. Whereas with other UFO reports, you can chase back to source documents. It might not get you anywhere, but at least you've got something to actually hold or to look at. Where with all that, you've got nothing, I'm afraid. So yeah, that's what it is.
I respect this part of you as a researcher, just simply because you really do stick to the facts, or stick to the provable evidence, the things you can track down and put hands on, which what you've come up with just the evidence is fascinating, man. I mean, there's so much cool stuff out there without having to go, down to Antarctica and whooping the U.S. in some crazy war from a secret Nazi base, which again is fun. That'd be a great place to launch your secret space program out into space, right? It's from down there, nobody's hanging out, nobody's paying attention. You can get away with a lot. But one thing that I think is interesting, and why I think that these things, and I'm sure you'll agree with this, these myths occur is because of all the factors, and especially the occult digging that the Nazis were doing, the mysterious element to all this, the Thrill Society and all of these different things and how it was connected. And then you look at New Schwabenland, because there is evidence that there was a Nazi base down there, right? But they allegedly went down there for whale oil to kind of fuel their machines and everything.
They sent an expedition down, I think it was either 37 or 38, and they had some seaplanes on board the aircraft, the ship that they sent down. And basically what they did was they flew the seaplane over the coast of Antarctica and dropped some little swastika kind of flags from the airplane. That's all they did.
It's like, that's ours. So, that's it.
Yeah, it was basically just a kind of a land grab, a kind of ceremonial land grab. But that's all they did. But before the war, they didn't really do anything else. They had, during the war, they had surface raiders, kind of like converted ships that were masquerading as kind of other vessels that were going around into the Indian Ocean to supply submarines and things like that. but they never really went anywhere near Antarctica. There was no point. We didn't have any forces down there. You didn't either. So there was no real kind of advantage to try and weaponize Antarctica in any way. And then the stories about the U-boats going down there at the end of the war, well, again, there's no kind of evidence. There was one that surfaced in Uruguay or Argentina at the end of the war a couple of months afterwards, but it was because they didn't get the surrender order until later on. And all the other ones actually went to port. They've all been accounted for. It's not as if any's gone missing anywhere. One of them actually does appear in the book because the submarine had some fairly interesting personalities on it in terms of possible transfers to Japan in terms of weapons technology, but nothing there could be actually sort of, looked at as, oh yeah, that was probably a Foo Fighters or something else, So the stories about crated jet fighters being put into submarines to send to the Japanese, well, no, they couldn't have done that because the submarines weren't big enough. So, there's a whole load of stuff that goes around that, and you just think, yeah, lovely stories. Make great books for people, and they have done in the past because people have made, maybe not a fortune, but they've certainly sold books on the premise. But actually, when you dig in and you try and get to the truth of it, you're left with, very little, if at all. So, yeah, nice stories. But that's all they are, I'm afraid.
And man, I go and I take these things a step further. Again, I just do this. This is just what I do. But I do enjoy those types of things because if you look at it, and there's a lot of arguments to be made. I mean, Jim Mars's book, The Fourth Reich, that Germany lost the war, that the Nazis did not. And there's a lot of evidence with this, with Project Paperclip, and then your mind just goes crazy, right? Where then you say, well, if there was any program with high technology being used and the Germans lost, but the Nazis did not, maybe the Nazis just grabbed it, brought it over here, and said, okay, here's what we know. We're going to fake everything else. And I think that these things are possible and that compartmentalization could happen. Even if, like, let's say that we were doing reverse engineering of craft in the U.S., then that type of stuff would be broken up and so compartmentalized that it is possible to kind of bury some of that stuff. And especially in a time before the internet. If it was all hard copies of things and they had one or two copies of it, you just carry that stuff off to your new home America, and then you create NASA, and then you continue the work, right?
There was definitely a lot of brain drain of German scientists and rocket technicians and all the rest of it that went both ways, both to America and to Russia, and to a very small extent to Britain, just straight after the war. But actually, some of it took some time because they were still rounding up people in 1946. And I mentioned that in the book as well, that there was a lot of people. But there's a lot of people they missed as well. Some of the designers are talking about those German flying discs that go back to these designers who said they built these things. A lot of that was down to them being a bit annoyed because they hadn't, they wanted a job in America, and they saw all these other people being taken off, and they were saying, well, I've got a bit of aviation knowledge, why can't I go out there? And that's why those stories came about. But that was all it was. It was basically a crude attempt to try and get to America to work on some aviation project. And probably when they were their histories were dug into, they were probably found wanting, and that's why they never went out there, because all these people just sort of drop off the radar afterwards. But yes, you're right. There were a lot of people who went to America and Russia, and if there were any kind of secret projects going on with reverse engineering things or just domestic building things domestically, then yes, those would have been the go-to guys, because at the end of the war they had probably the best in terms of theories and the best facilities for testing things. But whether they built anything, that's a completely different sort of question entirely. And the war ran out before a lot of the things that they were talking about could ever get put into practice, because there was a lot of squabbling during the war. There was a lot of political infighting. If you had to get sponsors basically to get any kind of project off the ground in Germany, and yet you could have the best war-winning project ever. But if some VIP in the Nazi Party didn't like you got nowhere, because your patronage was everything. And the Horton brothers, who built those flying wings, they didn't get sponsors because certain people in the hierarchy of the Nazi Party didn't like them, didn't like the kind of the cutting edge technology that they said they had. So they resorted to actually building things in a small workshop, and they were having to beg, borrow, and steal parts. They were having to lie to a jet engine manufacturer to try and get dummy sort of jet engines so they can work out the dimensions to put into the first prototype of the aircraft they were constructing. They were having to go that far to try and sort of get their aircraft airborne. So the people who try and turn around and say, oh, well, the Horton flying wings were the basis of the UFO reports. Well, you've got to look at kind of what kind of difficulties they were operating under just to get a prototype flying. So it was a lot going on that people put too much credit, I think, into a lot of things that didn't happen, or a lot of people who were working on things. They just didn't get as far as people sort of maybe like to think they did or believe they did. It's not that simple, I'm afraid.
I love the idea, though, that knowledge or some sort of resources withheld from the science because of they just don't care for you. They're like, no, he smells like Schlitz. I don't like him. He wore the wrong shoes, and it's just denied. Shut down. So, what do you think, though, is your favorite part about this time period and the research that you've done? What is your favorite thing that you've uncovered?
I think the thing that I'd like to be maybe just, if I'm going to be remembered for anything, it would be the number of reports I found from the Balkans during 1944. So that's a whole collection of reports from one particular part of Europe which have never been seen in print before. So in the course of the research, I started looking at various squadron records from the RAF through from 1942 through to the end of the war, because 42 is when most of them start kicking off. There were earlier ones, but the actual reports and to get to the nitty gritty, it's very vague. Whereas from about 42 onwards, you start seeing in the squadron records mention of strange things, like they call them meteors or they call them rockets, when such things didn't really sort of fly around. And then, of course, they turn them into lights, and then they call them mystery jets as well later in the war. But there's a reason why these things were called such descriptions. But there's a whole slew of reports in over like Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and southern Austria, right through 1944 and into 1945. And I found them in various squadron records. And these are from bomber units which were based in Italy, flying over these areas and bombing oil refineries and other installations. And they had, they were seeing red lights as well. They were seeing lights that were following the aircraft. They were seeing things were whizzing past airplanes. In a couple of cases, some of the Liberator bombers that the RAF were flying, the American supplied aircraft, these lights were surrounding their aircraft, 6 at a time sometimes. So there was clearly something weird going on, because this part of the world wasn't being used for testing rockets. So, and the Germans didn't employ operational flak rockets either. The only rocket they actually really put into service was the V2, and it didn't kind of fly that way. It went straight up, went to about 50,000 feet, then sort of turned on a side, and then flew horizontal for a bit, and then dropped down. It was the way it flew. It didn't chase after bombers. The V2 just didn't do that, and it wasn't a V1 flying bomb, because a pulse jet engine from a flying bomb was only effective to a few thousand feet. That's why they couldn't fit them to fighter aircraft, because they just were ineffective at high altitude. So you wouldn't see them at high altitude either. So therefore, that can rule those things out. So there's a whole load of reports that I have found. I don't know what they are still, but they're clearly the same thing. They're these mystery lights that were seen flying around, sometimes chasing aircraft, sometimes just whizzing past them, but very, very weird. And the crews then didn't know what they were either. But they thought they were German secret weapons. And that's the thread that just runs through all the reports, because they had no frame of reference. They didn't think they were UFOs or flying saucers. Those words weren't even in the lexicon then. They just thought, well, they must be German secret weapons, because, well, what else would they be?
And we see this a lot with descriptions of early, what we would describe now as high technological phenomena being described as something that either ancient people or people without a frame of reference would describe these things as, like lights in the sky gods, chariots, right? Ezekiel's wheel within a wheel type thing. And you come across these reports because there is no technological frame of reference. So it's interesting. But there was a technological frame of reference for rockets, and that's interesting that they were reported as such. Now, I've got a question about that particular report. If rockets weren't being used in the area at the time, was it people reporting them that were familiar with the fact that rockets existed, and so they thought that that's what they were, and so they described them that way? Even though rockets weren't being used?
There was an evolution in terms of the way that they were described. So at one time they were called meteors, or actually originally it was just lights. Then it was meteors and rockets, but they were expecting to see things at certain times, because the intelligence services were receiving reports of the Germans working with certain types of weapon. And there was a theory that they were probably developing some kind of rocket. What that kind of rocket was, it was unsure. And the Germans did have 50 different types of missile in development during the war. They had quite a lot. There were different types. There were air-to-air missiles, there were surface-launched missiles, there were anti-shipping missiles. The actual flak rockets, the surface-to-air ones, never got anywhere because there was protracted development time. There were delays. There were problems with the engines. There was a whole raft of things that went wrong that they couldn't put them into service, and they were in specific testing areas as well. So the report, you might have got away with saying, "Oh, well, a report in a certain area might have been that," but you couldn't apply that logic to right across Europe. And actually, the reports in 1942, when the first mention of rockets comes about in the intelligence reports, the Germans didn't even have rockets then anyway. And if they did, there was only one particular type, and that was a decoy for the flares that the Allies were using to mark targets. And they had a decoy rocket which could go at about 6,000 feet and then deploy parachutes, flares, which would simulate, like as a decoy, fake flares basically, but it wasn't widespread use either. So again, it was too low down. So you can't attribute that to some of the sightings in the intelligence reports. What they were saying, they were seeing these things flying around at 20,000 feet, 25,000 feet. So they're not the same thing. So the question is, what are they? But you can rule things out. But then it leaves you with, what the hell's going on? So there are rockets. But then actually you go forward a couple of years to 1944, in the summer of 44, and the Germans start deploying jets and rocket-powered aircraft, but just in the daytime. So therefore, you've got another element that you can understand the kind of the mindset in the Allied intelligence, and they'll be going, well, we're going to see these at night sometime. And funny enough, you get to October 1944, and you've read the book, you'll see this, that the RAF crews, the gunners, start seeing, or reporting rather, encounters with mystery jets in the start in October 1944, and they go right through the end of the war. But at that time, the Germans weren't deploying the Messerschmitt 262 as a jet fighter at night. In any case, the first unit only came on strength mid-December, and there was only one pilot who was qualified to fly the aircraft at night. And he spent most of the next month and a half training other pilots. They weren't even flying combat missions. And actually, when they did, they were restricted officially to the defense of Berlin because they were suffering night after night after night by Mosquito fighter bomber attacks. And that's why the jets were actually built to fly at night, was to combat that particular menace. So they weren't even allowed to fly over any part of Germany, other than Berlin. So all these reports of mystery jets were actually over the Ruhr, which was a couple of hundred miles to the west. So they weren't jets. Again, there's the question, what were they? And then they also report this rocket-powered aircraft, the Comet, seeing that at night as well. This little bat-shaped object that was a very difficult aircraft to fly in the daytime. It was powered by a very volatile fuels. But they see that at night as well. Well, they can't have, because it was never operated at night. It's too dangerous to fly in the day, never mind night. So again, what are they seeing? Are they just seeing things? But no, because actually in some cases they say they shot them down. So that's another element thrown into all this crazy mix as well. You've got all these elements of strange lights, strange rockets, strange jets, and now some of them, they're actually just exploding. It's all completely crazy.
And this is a testament to your research, man. You knew the only pilot that knew how to fly at night was busy that month doing something else. And you knew that those jets didn't fly at night generally, and the only one, like I said, was busy. And then that they were only allowed to fly in a certain area. So then you were able to kind of look out at other places and go, okay, well, if we can rule that off the list, at least from official reports, because you can't rule it out 100%. Maybe there were some secret missions being flown. And again, they just told you that the guy's on vacation or he's busy. So we wouldn't do that. Has there been a pattern that you found in all of the reports, because you do have the most reports of these through the longest time period, that have the most in frequency? Did you find that they only flew a certain time of day, or the consistently time of day, or a certain time of year, as far as like winter versus spring, or was it just open season?
So if you can imagine the subset of reports that I'm using in the book, that's all I can find. So if you go just on that alone, then you can see there's hotspots in terms of the reporting, but that also could be biased based on the quality of the intelligence staff in the particular squadrons. As I said before, the pilots were reporting things, but then they were getting the responses like, old man, have you been drinking? that was a popular question in the RAF. There was a lot of stigma back then as well, even though they knew that their colleagues had been seeing them, and sometimes there was a reluctance to report them. Sometimes just because it didn't go anywhere. They never got any sort of, there was no comeback in terms of, yes, this is what they are, or thanks for the information, we'll let you know what happens. There was none of that. The Americans were a bit more, they were less sensitive to the stigma. They actually did report things. And in one particular unit, as I mentioned, the intelligence officer actually compiled a list of all the crew's reports and then sent it up the chain. It didn't get anywhere because they didn't know what to do with it. They thought it was just lights on a particular aircraft, because the word came back down, well, which part of the aircraft are they seeing these lights on? Which just, kind of misunderstood entirely what he was telling them. So, but if you look at these, say, this subset of reports, yes, Western Germany in a triangle between Cologne, Aachen, and the Belgian border, that's one place. Northern Italy over the Po Valley, the Balkans, and there are others as well. But really, we're only going on the reports we know about from the squadrons who probably did the best work in recording the information. Just as an example, the RAF squadron reports, when you look into the official records, for each bomber squadron that was based in England, let's say, that were flying over Germany. So certain units will break down the records in terms of each aircraft for each squadron for each night. And you'll get maybe 5 or 6 lines from each aircraft saying, the time they took off, time they landed, what time they dropped their bombs, what the weather was like, were there any night fighters, and any other information, which is usually where these kind of things fall into. Other squadrons might have just had a summary for the raid, which covers all the aircraft and maybe 2 or 3 paragraphs, but there's no individual breakdown. And then for other squadrons, you're lucky if you get 2 lines for the same information. So you've got to wonder, these other squadrons, what were they seeing? Because that information is not in the official records. And it's just down to the fact there were the clerks, were they just too lazy to write it down, or did the intelligence officers who were responsible for collating this information didn't have the time or didn't have the inclination? You just wonder how much information was missing. Thankfully, we have pilot logbooks as well, which have cropped up from time to time. So that's your diary, the unofficial diaries. So you can find information in those, but those are few and far between. There will be loads of them more out there, I'm sure. And I do put a plea in the book for people who have relatives who have served in the war to go maybe have a look at that information and see what you can find, because I'm sure there'll be more information and details contained in those documents.
Absolutely. And again, you've done a wonderful job on the flight logs and reviewing those types of reports. Have you been able to corroborate any air-based with any ground-based observations that you could tie to the same incident?
So that's the thing, you see, because in the terms, let's say the Foo Fighters, as they were called by the Americans, the 415th Night Fighter Squadron, which were based in eastern France around Nancy, they were seeing these things night after night after night in December 1944. And also the 422nd Night Fighter Squadron, which were based in Belgium, a place called Firenze, they were seeing them as well. Now, both crews were seeing these lights. And in one particular case, and it's mentioned in the book, the pilot radioed the ground station, the radar station on the ground, because bearing in mind, these aircraft were being controlled by ground radar stations to within a few miles of a potential target. And then the onboard airborne radar, because it was very unsophisticated, would then take over. They only had a range of maybe 5 to 8 miles. So the guy in the back of the aircraft was hunched over a little set. It didn't even have the kind of revolving kind of display that you get on the modern radars when you see on air traffic control. It goes bip, bip kind of thing. It looked like an oscilloscope. And they had to try and decipher it to work out distance, speed, and all that kind of thing. So it was very, very crude. But so this pilot basically radioed the ground station to say, "We've had something. It's on our tail. It's gone off. Can you see it?" And they said, "You're on your own up there. There's nothing there." So there are no kind of they weren't picked up on radar.
Yeah, they weren't radar returned, which makes them even more mysterious, because there are a lot of UFO craft that get picked up on radar.
And here's the thing about the whole phenomenon. Other German secret weapons like the V1, the V2, the Allies knew about them through wrecks by bits, pieces. That there was there was a V2 crash in Sweden, on an island just off Sweden. There was one crash in Poland that the Polish resistance got a hold of and managed to smuggle the wreckage, parts of the wreckage, back to Britain. V1s they knew about through the French resistance before they were deployed operationally against Britain. So Allied intelligence actually had proper human signals or actual physical intelligence to know what these things were in advance. The Foo Fighters were something different. They were hamstrung by the fact that there was nothing physical. It was just the pilots' reports. You didn't have a crashed one, for instance. There was nothing like that. They couldn't get their hands on the technology to try and work out what the hell was going on. And we're still in the dark as far as that's concerned, because nothing's come to light in that respect. So it's incredibly weird. So there's another kind of little sort of mystery.
Absolutely. So out of all the reports, 0% of Foo Fighters were able to be returned on radar?
So as far as I'm aware, there are stories in the book about aircraft that were chasing after targets which they never could catch up with, and they were going here, there, and everywhere. In Italy, for instance, there's a story about a Mosquito, a crew of a Mosquito night fighter, and they were, I believe they were American as well, because they were using mosquitoes that were supplied by the British to the Americans in Italy, and they were vectored after target, and the target was just eluding them all the time. It was too fast. And Mosquito was a very fast aircraft, and the Germans didn't deploy jets to Italy, apart from 3 reconnaissance aircraft in March 1945, and this was in 1944. So you have to wonder what that aircraft was, if it was an aircraft. So yes, you could probably argue that maybe some of them were picked up on radar, but there's no hard and fast evidence for that. But whatever that was, it was fast enough to elude a Mosquito, and that was pretty good going for an Axis aircraft. So again, what was that? But most of the times when they saw these lights, whether it was in Italy or over Belgium, France, or Germany, or even over the Eastern Front, as far as they're aware, they weren't picked up on radar.
Were any of the pilots reporting craft along with the Foo Fighters as well, like a solid metallic disc and all that? Okay.
Yeah. So there's a famous report. Actually, this did come to light before 1905, when some of these reports, more reports came to light. There was a bombing raid in November 1942. It was a group of British bombers who were flying to northern Italy, round the side of the French Alps, to get there to bomb an engine factory in Turin. And over the Alps, or the Italian Alps, twice in the same night, they saw a 200-foot long object, a torpedo-shaped object, with portholes along the side of it.
Illuminated from the inside?
They just said that the report just says there were portholes, kind of, openings. They saw it, first of all, flying, near the aircraft, but the second time they saw it flying along a mountain valley. So, but in 2 different periods of time, spread maybe half an hour apart or something. I can't remember the exact time frame, but it was certainly twice in the same night. And then there was other reports of very, very large objects. There's also a report of just a very large light that followed an anti-submarine aircraft over the Bay of Biscay. It was actually an American aircraft in November 1942 as well. It was a U.S. Army Air Force aircraft, which was given that role because the U.S. Navy didn't send aircraft to Britain until about 6 months later. So, but yeah, that's another story as well. Photographs were supposed to be taken of that object, but they've never been discovered. They've never been located.
I love this, man. You are absolutely fascinating. So, of course, guys, here is the book for the video audience. I will, of course, link this down in the show notes. Highly, highly recommended. If you got some time to spend on it, this is an incredible read, man. You've got just so many wonderful accounts. Again, the way that you tie all this together is very impressive. So let's have some fun with this, okay? Put the researcher hat off. Let's speculate wildly. Let's have some fun. So, not holding you to any ideal, if you had a preference, if you had just a choice, what's your favorite explanation for this stuff?
My favorite one, if I had to go and say this is the one I'd love to have, would be time travelers from the future, because that's what I would want. That's what I would want to do. If you could give me a machine right now to say, when do you want to go back in history, Graeme? What do you want to look at? That's the period I'll be looking at, because that's the time I'm interested in, and I've been interested in pretty much all my life. So I'd want to see the kind of battles unfold. I'd want to see the aerial war over Europe. I want to see some of the battles on the Eastern Front. There's actually a good story from one of the battles there about something that was watching a battle from overhead, and it was watching the aircraft dogfighting below it and the battle on the ground below. So that's what I'd want to do. Now, whether that's the case, well, it's as good as theory as any, isn't it? But it could be people from elsewhere or things from elsewhere looking at us and watching, as we said before, about watching a warlike species. Yeah, you name it, it's a good enough theory. It's as good as any other. Let's put it that way.
And let's take it even further. How about that? So let's say that Foo Fighters are you from the future, because time travel's been created, but the way in which we time travel is to be, in this little ball or this orb, or maybe it's even an artifact. Maybe it's an artifact of time travel, how we have to do it, maybe in the near future, that you send basically like an orb that you look through and you're controlling, you're doing all of it, but you're not necessarily locally there. Now, the ironic part about this would be, of course, you would go to this time period because this is what fascinates you. The reason it fascinates you is because of all the German technology and the Foo Fighters themselves. So therefore, in this crazy model that we've just created here, you actually go back in time, or once time travel is developed, you go back in time to see a period that you're attracted to because of the fact that you're there observing it in the past from the future. And it's this cyclical thing to where you have to go investigate yourself, investigating this time. God, I love time travel, man. That's one of my favorites too.
Paradoxes.
Gotta love it, man. Okay, now I like the time travel thing, and Dr. Michael P. Masters, of course, Diane Tessman, Alan Butler have written great books on this subject, and it is one of my favorite as well. And if you would have asked me this 6 months ago, that's what I would have picked too. It's still a tie for first with me, but interdimensional I think is very cool because it can explain, when you viewed through that lens, a variety of phenomena that probably all have to do with one another.
They're all as valid as each other, right? Really, because we're not experts. We don't know what's going on. It could be something else completely that nobody's considered.
Absolutely.
But the fun thing is that you can speculate without any kind of obligation as to that has to be the truth. And I don't want to be the person who, I'm going to put my researcher hat on again. Sorry.
That's okay.
I don't want to be the person who then says it's this and then has to then defend it 5 years down the line when the information changes and comes up with some crazy narrative and starts, I'll start negotiating like different kind of corners and all the rest of it to try and work myself down this road so I can fulfill all these, little niches and go, yeah, it's because of that. Oh no, it's because of this. It would drive me insane. So I'd rather just go, look, I don't know what it is. I can probably tell you what it's not, but that's as far as I can go. And I'm happy with that and I'm comfortable. Yes, okay, I can come on a show like yours and have a bit of fun and say, it's possibly time travelers. But if you want to pin me down, I'm going to revert to type. I'm sorry. I'm going to say,
and that's okay.
I don't know.
That's why I had the caveat of take your researcher hat off. I kind of had to shift you out of that mode because me personally, I'll just take that right-hand turn and you're just like, where did we come from with this? And it's awesome. But I do like, and of course, we're not holding you to any of your theories that you'd rather them be. But I like this, man. So do you think that there's anything to the Fourth Reich thing that maybe the Germans lost, but the Nazis won, and then therefore they've perpetuated this kind of whatever we see the world as today?
I think we give them too much credit. A lot of people seem to think that they were the be-all and end-all of everything in terms of how organization work and how effective military operations were and all the rest of it. But actually, when you read a lot about it, they had a huge amount of human failings, jealousy, petty rivalry, just general lack of preparedness. So they're not the supermen that people thought they were. Now, in terms of the technology transfers, certainly they were in demand. But whether or not that translated to some kind of overarching organization that lasted beyond the end of the war, I don't think so. I think that is crediting them with too much. But yes, the technology and the knowledge was certainly tapped into. That's a fact. You can't get around that. But I think to take it a bit further than that, I think people might have thought it comes across as maybe a good idea in terms of how plausible it might be. But I think if you look into it a bit more, then I think, again, it's one of these kind of smoke and mirrors things. You can only get so far where you just run out of actually proof, or rather there's just none to start with. And you just start running around in circles. And that's when people start making things up to try and suit narratives. And that's when I sort of go, okay, right, I've had enough, thanks. And I start walking, and I walk away then, So, but I'll take it so far. And don't get me wrong, as I say, I'll read things and I'll entertain people, because actually if somebody came to me with a plausible and actually some proof and went, there you go, Graeme, that actually is the reason why, and it's something I'll go, oh yeah, okay, that makes sense. Then yeah, I'll hold my hands up and go, yeah, I might be wrong on this. You can be right, but I've yet to get that bit yet, I'm afraid. So,
and this is why I asked, is because I'm with you on this. I think that it's either one of two things. It's either absolutely extreme and absolutely that's what's happening, and there's this crazy secret space program with all this technology, and us mere mortals down here, us masses, right, just kind of still, put gas in our car to drive around and stuff, right? But there's another part of me, and this is what's fun about this kind of idea as well, is that says that they just make up these stories to make themselves seem more omnipotent or powerful or excuse me, or in control, when they're really not. And so what they have is they've hijacked basically an actual mystery in this place and have said, yeah, that's possibly us, or have slipped in enough things to plant the seed that that's possible, and therefore people are like, oh, don't mess with them, man, they have UFOs, they have all this stuff. But in reality, they don't know what the hell it is. I mean, there's part of me that thinks that they're, like you said, disorganized, we'll say big dummies, and that they couldn't possibly do this, right? It's either way. Now, the research has led you to the latter on that, but I still kind of speculate wildly on the other side, on the former example to that, to say, well, maybe, and it's, again, fun. I think that that's what it is. It's fun. You're like, secret space program, hell yeah, let's do it, right? So do you think that there's anything to like a breakaway civilization or something like that? Like a secret space program?
The secret space program, I have a hard job believing it, because of maybe how much we would be involved in trying to hide it. I think that there would have been, the cracks would have showed by now. It's like the kind of people who say, oh, the moon landings didn't happen. It's things like that. The amount of work that you need to be able to hide something of that magnitude, it's this kind of thing of giving people credit for too much. I just don't think it's possible. People are mortal. They make mistakes. They slip up, and I don't think you can have this coherent narrative that would stay in place for so long. I think people would see through it. I have a hard time believing things like that. But again, say if somebody came to me tomorrow and said, look, there you go, Graeme, here's the categorical proof, and I can't shoot holes in it, then yeah, fine, okay, I'm wrong, you're right. So I'll be the first to hold my hands up and say, yeah, sorry, I got that completely wrong. But I'm not there yet.
I tend to lean on that as well, because again, I think that people just want to talk about stuff. They're like, hey, dude, I'm checking on it. And especially something of that magnitude. Now, when you look at things like compartmentalization, again, I mean, even that is so hard to believe. It's not improbable. It's improbable, but it's not impossible, right? It's not likely, but it could happen, or you just let a few people know and then just go bury them out in the desert when they're done with their job, right? Training accidents happen all the time. So what do we have to look forward to in future work from you, brother?
So you'll see from the title of the book that I only looked at the European cases during the war. There are plenty of cases from the Pacific War, and that's the bit I'm working on next. So I'm at the initial stages of looking into the kind of records that I looked for this one, to see what kind of scale and the geographical scale, but also the time frame that was involved there. It'll be a similar kind of book, I'm afraid, but it'll deal with those particular cases, but it won't have the Nazi flying saucer element in it. It might have some other stuff, because who knows where it'll take me. I'm the kind of person who I go where the data takes me. So I can't say at the moment what the book will pan out to be, but I will do the research that is warranted, and then I'll see what I come up with, and that's all I can promise at the moment.
Well, whatever you come up with next, I know it's going to be amazing, and I'm looking forward to that. And so, guys, make sure to check out the show notes, of course, for UFOs Before Roswell, European Foo Fighters, 1940-1945. Graeme, you're a badass, man. If I don't mind saying so myself, you are awesome. I've really enjoyed speaking with you. Before we close out here, was there anything else you wanted to touch on?
There's one particular thing I'd like to say before I close. There's three people I'd like to thank in connection with the book. The first two are Dan Zetterstrom and Olaf Rockner. For people who are on UFO Twitter, they'll know who they are. They're the people who created that awesome cover, which on the book.
I was telling the wife about this, and the mat, I mean, just their cover, everything about this, man, is so cool.
So that particular cover is a case that's covered in the book. And it's from a Wellington bomber crew who opened fire at a light and nothing happened. So that is possibly, it's a really, really good case. So they came up with that artwork in secret. They didn't even tell me they were doing it. I found out, a few weeks afterwards when I was going to ask Dan to say, would you consider doing the cover? Oh, we've already got one. We're already doing one.
This is a testament to you, man. People want to see you succeed. This is one of my favorite, the information, of course, but this is an awesome cover. So they did a great work.
Yeah, they did. So the third person is actually on the cover there, Sean Cahill, the one of the witnesses to the 2004 the Nimitz encounters. It was a kind of like punching above my weight kind of thing, asking him in the first place. But he said yes. And I didn't realize that he had this personal connection with the Foo Fighters, which he's never ever he's never told anybody else before, certainly not in public. But, he was generous enough to give me that information in the form of a forward. So I am incredibly grateful to Sean as well for doing that for me. And it just sets the book off nicely. He's got a real way with words. And Sean's one of those people that, when he speaks, people listen. So it was wonderful really to get his involvement in the book and his blessing. So I'm really thankful for him as well. And to everybody else in UFO Twitter and beyond who gave me words of support and encouragement when they knew I was writing the book. I had a piece published in the Debrief back in April this year, which Chris Mellon, he commented on Twitter. He liked what I've written. So that was quite a boost as well. So all those people, everybody who said something and mentioned something and just, chivied me along a bit, then, thank you. And thanks to people like yourself who have given me the platform to also speak on the subject afterwards, because it's something that people don't talk about very much. They like all the other things, they like the Tic Tacs, they like the flying saucers, all that kind of thing. Foo Fighters generally don't get a look in, so I'm pleased to be able to maybe rectify that kind of imbalance a little bit. So yeah, thanks very much.
Oh, you kidding me? No, this is an honor all on this side, but I'm with you on this. I think that Foo Fighters are kind of like the crop circle phenomena. It's one of those things that's not focused on, but when you take another look at it, or especially the kind of look that you did in your book, unbelievable. It sets the mind wild. It's just whimsical. It shows you that this place is so cool and there's so many mysteries here. And you did a wonderful job. Like I said, of course, I will be linking all of the ways to find this and yourself and some UFO Twitter stuff as well, of course, man, down in the show notes. So y'all go check that out. Follow up with Graeme. He does a wonderful job, and I can't thank you enough, man, for your time and your expertise and coming on, and especially for taking that researcher hat off and going down some rabbit holes with me. I appreciate it.
I don't mind doing that, yeah. And thanks for buying the book as well, and thanks for reading it, and thanks for enjoying it as well.
Oh, absolutely. It came in and the wife was like, what's this? I was like, I'm interviewing him. It's so cool. And she was like, God, I love this. I was like, I know. So I'll let her thumb through it after I completely finish it. So again, my friend, thank you. Thank you so much. Let's do this again.
Yeah, wonderful. Thanks again. Cheers.
Want to give a huge shout out to Graeme Rendall for spending some time with us on the show. His book, of course, UFOs Before Roswell, European Foo Fighters, 1940 to 1945, an incredible read, is linked down in the show notes. Like I said, guys, the research that he did is phenomenal. I highly, highly recommend this book. That's why we had him on, because he's fantastic and he wrote an incredible book, and he's got some awesome stuff coming up in the future that we will definitely be looking forward to. So again, down in the show notes, guys, is where you can find all of his stuff. Also down there, the music that you're hearing underneath this is Vinny the Saint, great friend of mine. He makes some incredible music. Go check the show notes on how to contact him. He would love to do some music for you as well. So go check that out, guys. Also linked down there is the website, expandingrealitypodcast.com. Links to all the socials. It's kind of a hub for everything, right? So you just go down there. All the videos are located there as well. It also has the links for merchandise, which is through TeePublic, which we're very excited about. They do all kinds of cool stuff. And then also Rokfin for our premium content, which has a ton of other content creators' premium stuff on there as well. Could not be happier that we are a part of that incredible platform. So y'all make sure to check out the links in the bottom of the show notes for more information on Graeme and this show in particular. Okay, so go out into this crazy, mysteriously awesome place this week, guys. Pick up a piece of litter, of course. Don't litter in the first place. That would be incredibly dope of you. And then buy a coffee or a meal or a bottle of water or something like that. Book a stamps. It doesn't have to be crazy, but it makes a crazy cool impact on everyone around you, and especially you. Like I said, I highly approve of this practice because it's so effective for the ripple effects that translate into everybody's world, even something that small. Opening a door for someone, all of that stuff, guys. So, of course, be nice to every entity, animal, person, human, everything that you come across. If you come across a Foo Fighter, be nice. They're probably pretty cool and chill, and they just want to kind of check you out anyway. Get out of the left-hand lane, of course, it's annoying, and then go out into this beautiful, big, amazing place, whatever the hell this thing is, and y'all just be good to one another. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next time.